The 1980s were the acme of flamboyant and outlandish pop music with lip gloss, big hair and megabucks videos.
It's Christmas time. There's no need to be afraid.
But more than 5,000 miles away in Ethiopia, millions of people were starving. The singer Bob Geldof was inspired to convene dozens of fellow musicians to do something to help. The resulting single, under the banner of Band-Aid, was Do They Know It's Christmas?
Throw your arms around the world at Christmas time. But say a prayer.
It went straight to #1 in December 1984 and became the fastest-selling single of all time. And it led the following year to Live Aid, the biggest televised pop spectacle the world had ever seen. To date, the Band-Aid Trust has raised more than £140 million for famine victims in Africa. But Band-Aid wasn't the first time that musicians had united behind a good cause.
Few musical events in recent years have attracted as much attention as George Harrison's concert for the relief of the refugee children of the Holocaust in East Pakistan.
In 1971, George Harrison organised the Concert for Bangladesh in New York, releasing a live album which spawned a single. It raised an estimated $12 million for funds in flood-hit Bangladesh, but only after the American Inland Revenue Service had taken their cut.
The tax people, they don't help. They make it so that it's not worthwhile doing anything decent.
Well, what more do you want? Second week at #1, take it easy. It's the Boomtown Rats.
In the UK, Bob Geldof was best known as the lead singer of the Irish punk band The Boomtown Rats, topping the charts with I Don't Like Mondays in the summer of 1979. In October 1984, he was watching BBC News when he saw this report on the famine in Ethiopia. The cameraman was Mohammed Amin and the reporter Michael Burke.
Dawn, and as the sun breaks through the piercing chill of night on the plain outside Coram, it lights up a biblical famine, now in the 20th century. Death is all around. A child or an adult dies every 20 minutes.
Included in that report was 23-year-old British nurse Claire Birchinger, who was running a feeding station for the Red Cross that was short of aid and turning people away.
I feel terrible because it's sending them to a certain death, because there's nothing we can do. Food won't even help.
But making that decision day after day, does that do anything too?
Yes, of course it does. What do you expect? Yes, of course it does.
To many, the British government didn't seem to have any sense of urgency about what was going on. Overseas Development Minister Timothy Raisin.
We have, of course, been providing aid, famine relief and so on to Ethiopia for some time, so it's certainly not the case that we have been doing nothing in this field.
Bob Geldof's first call was to Midge Ure, the Scottish lead singer of the band Ultravox.
And he said he'd just seen the Michael Burke report. And then the immediate problem we had was what we were going to record. I mean, we realised that you can't just go out and do, a cover of White Christmas or whatever, because, half the money that's earned would go to, the Irving Berlin estate or whatever. So we had to write something.
Gary Kemp from Spandau Ballet was signed up from the start.
He's very gregarious, Bob, and he has this huge phone book and he knows everybody. And so if there was ever going to be anyone who could be the agent to all these musicians, it would be Geldof.
Perhaps you'd like to vaguely describe what you're up to.
Well, what we're up to is...
Geldof went public with his plan on Richard Skinner's Radio 1 show.
To sing on a song that Midge Ure from Ultravox and myself have written called Do They Know It's Christmas?
Within days, Duran Duran, U2, Bananarama, Kool and the Gang, Status Quo and Culture Club had signed on for what turned out to be an epic production. Well, joining me today on Christmas Day to discuss the phenomenal success of Do They Know It's Christmas are Gary Kemp of Spandau Ballet, John Moss of Culture Club, Mariella Frostrup, who was working at Phonogram Records at the time, former Radio 1 DJ Richard Skinner, you heard just there, the director of the Band-Aid video, Nigel Dick, and the organiser of Band-Aid himself, Sir Bob Geldof. It's reunion on Christmas morning, so I will say Happy Christmas to you all.
Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Bob Geldof, you were interested in politics and trying to bring about change from a young age. What was that background like? What were you doing?
I think I always associated with rock and roll with the idea of change. In school, the South African rugby team were coming to play Ireland, and me and my friend Mick Foley organised a sort of lame protest march against it, and thousands showed up, and I got a baton across my left eye for my trouble, but we did stop the game. So when punk came along, punk was actively about change. Music couldn't change things of itself, but it could bring people together, and together is political. Once things get political, it's game on.
And Richard Skinner, in the mid-1980s, it was just a heyday for British pop. It was global.
It was. I mean, the music that had started out in the early 80s, the New Romantics that had been largely played in evening shows on Radio 1, had finally broken through videos particularly, to the mainstream. And so from 81, when I was playing stuff at night, these same guys were suddenly the global stars and dominating the top 40 in primetime radio.
And video had really taken off. And Gary Kemp, MTV really helped with all that.
Yeah, I mean, it was this pipeline that sent what was happening in Britain across the world. And I think it was what Bob was plugging into, was the sense of power that we had at that time. We could say something and within hours it would be everywhere.
John Moss, let's just talk about what was happening in Ethiopia at that time and your reaction to it.
I remember seeing it on the television, and obviously you see the biblical scenes of famine. So seeing this scene, there was this sense of revulsion. But also, what can I do? I can give some money. Am I going to go over there and help them? No, of course I'm not. I'd like to think I would do.
But Bob, you watched that report by Michael Burke, and at that point you knew you had to do something.
Now, the rats had passed their peak, to put it kindly, but the new kids on the block, the culture clubs, the Spandaus, they were killing it. And couldn't stand the music, obviously, especially Spandau Ballet and Culture Club. So the key is that Culture Club and Gary Kemp are not at home at 6 o'clock in the evening in general. They were off doing their interviews, their tours, their recordings, saying, Geldof slumps home, being told yet again by phonogram, it's another step Bob or something it isn't. and there was my little firstborn and my missus, Paula. And we turn on the news and there's this horror. Here were these elegant, dignified people holding these children, but really hardly recognizable at this point, with the distended stomach and the saucer eyes, and just staring at you while they held these children who have a little top knot on their head. The rest of their head is shaved for medical reasons, for lice, but they keep a top knot so that when they die, God can just reach down and take their hair and pull them up into heaven. And Burke's words, they're consumed with rage and shame and anger. And then brilliantly, he puts this young white girl in the middle of this, whose heart is broken, having to be made the ultimate Sophie's choice. I have enough here to feed 3 kids. The others have to die. Paula went up to Newcastle for the next day's show of the Tube, and we had a green bowl on the table, and Paula had put a note on the fridge saying everyone who comes to this house has to put £5 in the bowl. And I thought it's not enough. So I called Paula, who's on the Tube this week. By pure chance, it's Midge. He was number 2 with Vienna, classic song. And I said, if we get a record out by Christmas, we make 100 grand. And that's the most we can do. We give it to Oxfam.
Mariella, I mean, you knew Bob, you were working at Phonogram.
I knew Bob. I was given, when I first went to work at Phonogram, I was given the 2 grumpiest Irishmen in the world to work with. One was Bob and the other was Van Morrison. So I had my hands full in my late teens and early 20s. And Bob came into Phonogram, as was his wont, to moan and groan about various things. And basically, he sequestered my desk, and the entirety of Band Aid, and I think quite a lot of Live Aid, was organised from my tiny open-plan desk, phoning around every single musician, every promoter, every single person he could possibly convince to get involved.
Gary Kemp, you were the first performer to commit.
This story is sort of symbolic of the 80s in a way, because here's a working-class lad, and I'm standing in an antique shop. And I see Bob walk by, and he bangs on the window. And, of course, we abuse each other, gesticulate something to each other. He comes in, and the first thing he says is, "Did you see the Michael Burke report last night?" And I hadn't. And he said, "Do you think we could make a record? You know, I'm talking to Midge, and do you think we could pull something together, all of these bands, us and Duran?" I didn't think we could do it, because we hated each other. We were all in such great competition with each other. And anyway, none of us are ever in the country at the same time. So I said, "We're flying to Japan. We're going to be doing a tour of Japan." I said, "If it happens, call me." I got the call in Japan. And he said, "It's on, Kemp. Are you up for it?"
John Moss, you were Culture Club's drummer, but you weren't sure about doing it at first.
I think we'd been in America, and I'd been back a short while, and I was very tired. And Bob called me, I think it was quite early in the morning, if I remember. He said, "You've got to come down. You've got to come down." I went, "Well, I don't know." He went, "Don't give me that. You've just got to come down." He was so insistent, and thank God for that.
Nigel Dick, you were working at Phonogram. Tell me what it was like getting the call to make this video.
I'd just come back from lunch. It's a Wednesday afternoon, and it's just a very simple conversation. "We're going to make a record at the weekend, and we want you to film it, and it needs to be ready by Tuesday lunchtime so it can be shown to the folk at the BBC who are planning Top of the Pops, and it's going to be on Top of the Pops on Thursday. So you've got a 7.5-day window to shoot, make, create something which you don't know what it is, for a song that's still not been written, for a group which doesn't have a name."
Richard Skinner, it was in your Radio 1 show that the project was announced, so tell me what happened.
I mean, my producer just told me that Bob had an announcement to make. I thought maybe the Rats were touring and we were going to hear about it. But it turned out that Bob had very different ideas. And basically, this is the day before the recording. He announced it all.
Was there a bit of cynicism from some quarters about what it might sound like? I mean, presumably it could have been a disaster.
It could have been a disaster. Actually, it didn't really matter what it sounded like anyway, because it's just, the song is a vehicle to raise money. And it didn't matter if it was the worst song ever recorded. The fact of the matter is people would buy it, the money would be raised, and Ethiopia would be helped.
Bob, give us a sense of how the anatomy of how that song was written.
God bless Midge. I mean, he just sent me very quickly a tape set of this little riff. Do, 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 do. And I thought, okay, that's quite good. So I had an old Rats tune called "It's My World," just a sketch. The Rats thought it was crap. And I've got the notebook, and really there's not very much scratched out. I didn't have the chorus. I didn't have the payoff. Get up to Midge's. He goes, "What's that?" And I said, "It's better than the shite you have." And he said, "What's wrong with that?" And I said, "It's Z chorus. That's what you've written, the Z chorus theme."
On the morning of November the 25th, 1984, the press descended on Sarm West Studios in Notting Hill, West London, the location for the Band Aid recording. Bob Geldof greeted the camera crews.
Well, Duran and Spandau have just landed. Bono has just come in.
What do you think is going on for then?
Midge and I will be here until tomorrow morning.
A clearly excited John Moss of Culture Club was one of the first to arrive.
I got a phone call from Bob last night telling me to come. And Phil Collins is going to be here, which is wonderful.
Inside the studio, filmmaker Nigel Dick had exclusive access to the gathering stars. Among them, Sting, lead singer of The Police.
No matter how much you send away to Ethiopia, it's never enough. So the chance to do something else, something extra, was a welcome one, and I hope we make a good record.
The first thing you have to do is knock it down into sections.
In the main studio, Midge had a guide backing track ready.
To be a verse and a chorus and a midsection and whatever.
He later admitted to lifting the opening drum beat from the Tears for Fears album, The Hurting.
And I sampled this drum sound to give me this percussive thing at the beginning, this great sound. So that instantly you start to get a bit of body with the track. You started bringing in bells. Think Christmas, of course. So we get these nice bells.
Meanwhile, in the green room, Bob Geldof performed an acoustic version of the song to the assembled musicians.
Oh, in our world of plenty, we can spread a smile of joy. Throw your arms around the world at Christmas time.
Bob's girlfriend, Paula Yates, the presenter of Channel 4 music show The Tube, helped keep spirits up.
Now, I went to bed last night at
Did
9
you?
o'clock and I had a bowl of ready bread in bed. And
Is that what you call it these days? Go on.
Christmas time.
One by one, the singers were called in to record their vocals. Paul Young's hit, Wherever I Lay My Hat, had topped the charts in the summer of '83.
When I came into the studio, he hadn't quite decided he was going to sing the beginning of the song, and I think they were trying to keep it open for Bowie in case David Bowie could get there, and then at the last minute he couldn't.
Are the clanging chimes of the... He actually holds back.
Mid-Ure and Bob Geldof had a particular line in mind for Bono, lead singer of U2.
I'm here with all these people I don't know. I just know Bob. He gives me the lyrics. I read the lyric and I say, I'll sing any line except that one. He says, that is the lyric I've been keeping for you. Tonight, thank God, it's them instead of you. I said, I can't sing it. I just can't sing that line. He said, you have to, because that's the one that's going to hurt the most. I still don't like the way it sounds. It's a little voice trying to be a big one, and it's a little man carrying a very big idea.
Well, tonight, thank God it's them instead of you.
He's such a liar.
Bob Geldof.
Let me just pull him up there. We go forward now another generation of kids, Band 820. And there was this queue of people who wanted to do Tonight, Thank God It's Them Instead of You, because they just wanted to beat Bono, you know. And and Justin from The Darkness pushed everyone aside. So he was standing at the mic next minute. I promise you, the door opens and Bono says, he's not doing my line, is he? Seriously, that's exactly what happened.
Gary Kemp, you were in Germany the night before the recording session, so you had to race back.
We'd flown from Japan to Germany to do this Tommy's Pop Show, and we met up with Duran Duran, who were also on the show. And of course, there was a big drinking match that went on. There was huge hangovers. But what we did both decide to do was we both chartered planes. And in a way, well, this is it. You see, this is the epitome of the 80s, right? We had to get back. Mm-hmm. We then spend the whole flight with the pilot trying to race each other across Europe back there. We made a huge mistake, I have to say, in that what happened in those days is record companies would always send you a Daimler Princess car. And, you know, Bananarama got it right. They're in a little 3-door Ford. Sting gets it right. Weller gets it right. They get their limos to drop them off around the corner and they look like they're walking to work, right? But, you know, the point is, actually nobody knew how to behave. It seems like we were all enjoying ourselves too much. We're all smiling when we get out. We're all so glad to be here.
But just seeing these people, Gary and Simon the Bond and all these people just getting out of cabs, morning, and it was freezing cold morning, but it was very sunny and crisp. So it was quite a surreal scene because the egos in that room could have created an atom bomb. I remember Sting just standing in a corner wearing his sort of Issey Miyake weirdly fitting clothes, looking much taller than I remember him. And
everyone's taller than you, George.
I remember George came in late. He sat down, he said, I need a drink. And Bob said, there's a pub around the corner, which I thought was brilliant. George was completely stumped.
Mariella Frostrup.
You know, these were a group of people that you would normally not see. They were like, you know, vampires. They didn't come out till night. Bob had to be quite emphatic about the fact that people had to be there on time and they had to be there early because we only had the studio for the day. And, you know, he didn't want to waste Trevor Horn's generosity.
Let's just talk about how it started, because it was a genius idea just to get everybody to sing the chorus at first.
At the very beginning, there was a sort of who wants to go first. It was very like school. None of the singers, none. Tony Hadley You know, like I thought he'd immediately march up. Yes, this is meant for me. Thank you. Move aside. No one in front of their peers were mortified.
Gary Kemp.
What I think is really great about the record is the quality of the singing. And
true.
That was obvious when we were in that room that
Especially
day.
your part.
This is pre-auto-tune. You know, people were going out and they'd only just heard the tune that minute, and they were singing beautifully, extraordinary vocals.
Nigel Dick.
There was a point where we shot the big chorus, and I remember counting a total of 72 people in the room. And eventually I got upset and I said, if anybody walks across this mark, I'll send you out of the room. And there was a moment of silence, and then I could hear behind me all the singers going, ooh. Ooh, he's upset now.
John Moss, as a drummer, you really wanted to meet Phil Collins.
I did. I mean, thank God that Bob didn't ask me to play on it, because, I mean, Phil Collins did such a great job. I was very excited about meeting Phil Collins. The only other person I've been excited about meeting was, apart from Bob, of course, years ago, was Simon Sharma. But
he wasn't on it, actually.
No, he wasn't on it.
He didn't sing.
Band-Aid.
Yeah.
So I met Phil and he was a bit off to me, and I was a bit like, well, I thought he was a nice guy. But later on, I said, it was really great to meet you the other day, Phil. I said, I'm not being funny, but were you in a bad mood or anything? He went, no, I was in awe of you.
I actually think that the person who really brought people together that day was Paula, who'd walk around with Fifi and pull everyone together. She knew us all from the Tube. She was very, very gregarious. She was, I absolutely adore Paula. And I think she brought some spirit of generosity into the proceedings while we were all trying to get to know each other.
The Band-Aid sessions went on well into the evening, by which time fans had gathered outside.
In our world of plenty.
Boy George arrived from New York to record his vocal.
Throw your arms around the world at Christmas time. Where nothing ever grows.
Midge and producer Trevor Horn recorded the harmonies and chorus sections.
Another 15 singers, and they're sitting listening to him and seeing if he was singing sharp and flat and all that. It was very good. Everybody was very, very funny.
Do They Know It's Christmas was released on Monday, December the 3rd.
At number 3, The Power of Love, Frankie Goes to Hollywood.
Everyone was listening to the charts that weekend.
And straight in at the top spot, the fastest-selling record in history from Band-Aid.
But a row was brewing about the fact that 15% of the money raised from the single went back to the government in the form of VAT.
Labour MPs have reacted angrily to Mrs.
The Labour
Thatcher's
Party's assistant Treasury spokesman, just a few months into his first front bench appointment, was Tony Blair.
All we're saying to them is, look, everyone's done their bit. You've got this money in circumstances where you wouldn't have got it but for the famine. That money should be allocated to famine relief.
We had a bit of a problem with the VAT on the record.
I know, but don't forget...
Bob Geldof wasn't impressed either, but surrounded by camera crews, he just happened to bump into Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher at an awards do.
I mean, at the moment, you've got a problem with the butter amount and you don't know how to dispose of it. To sell to the Russians is the cheapest way.
I'm sorry, but butter doesn't do very much good in Africa, as you know.
Well, butter oil actually does. It is one of the major supplementary foods.
If you can get it. But don't
Prime Minister, there are millions dying, and that's the terrible thing.
Yes, indeed.
But it's very much the survival of the fittest.
A few months later, Midge and BBC reporter Chris Lowe went to a refugee camp in Ethiopia.
Smiling faces. They get reasonable shelter, but not enough yet.
Meanwhile, nurse Claire Birchinger was still working at her Red Cross feeding station in Koram when she heard about Band-Aid, as she told us on the reunion in 2009.
The one thing I did hear is the BBC World Service, and it sort of comes and goes, these old shortwave radios, so it wasn't quite clear, and I could hear this song being sung, Feed the World, Do They Know It's Christmas, by Band-Aid, and this guy named Bob Geldof was raising funds for Ethiopia. And I remember getting really angry because I thought this Bob Geldof, was making money for himself. And I thought they need more than the bloody Band-Aid for this famine. And no, they don't know it's Christmas because Ethiopia has a completely different calendar and it's not Christmas at the time. It took me many months before realising what was happening and why it was happening.
Nigel, then, the record's coming out, it's been hugely important. You had 24 hours to edit the video ready for that week's Top of the Pops. Tell me about the pressure of that.
Very simply, we shot all day at the studio. Then I took the first bunch of dailies to the lab on Sunday night. We spent all day transferring it. We spent all night editing it. And it's like, we've got a big hole here where Boy George should be. Or perhaps it's on this next reel. So we're editing a video with black holes in it. You know, have we got this shot? Well, I'm sure we were shooting it. Plus, it's rather difficult because you're in a room with 35 extremely famous people.
Bob Geldof.
3 a.m. when we were mixing, I was on to Robert Maxwell because Kelvin Mackenzie was editor of The Sun. I'd rung him up and I'd said, okay, can we have the front page? And he goes, for what? And I said, are you joking? Yeah, this is the greatest collection of British musicians ever. And he goes, no, mate, we got Diana on the front. What, again? Like for the 7th day in a row? And she goes, yeah, but she's got a new dress on and we've got the exclusive, you know? Yes. So I rang Robert Maxwell and he goes, so Bob, if we do a poster in the middle and we charge £1, you get 50 pence and we get 50 pence. I said, why do you get 50 pence? He goes, because of the Daily Mirror's Ethiopian appeal. Robert, you don't have an Ethiopian appeal. We do now. I mean, he was such a scuzzbag.
But Richard, you presented Roundtable on Radio 1, played all the new releases. What did you think of it as a pop song?
I've got to say, we thought it was fantastic because it draws you in from the beginning. It's got a really good hook. And at the end, that chorus just keeps you going. I mean, it is a fantastic record. And Bob, you and Midge really should be proud of it because it stands up today, all these years later, and it still works.
And Mariella, how did you feel when you heard that final recording?
Listen, I'm a huge fan of the record. I still get shivers down my spine when I hear it play. The work then was promoting it, was getting Radio 1 on board. We needed to get tabloid press for it because tabloid press was how you really reached a bigger audience. You know, it had to be a hit. You know, it wasn't a vanity exercise. It had to make money. That was the point of it.
Bob Geldof, tell me about being invited to number 10.
Well, I bumped into Margaret Thatcher at some lunch awards thing. So I was kind of pushed in her path. They said, Bob Geldof, Prime Minister. Yes, Mr. Geldof, you know, this sort of thing. So that's when that argument started. I hadn't prepared to say, but people are dying right now, Prime Minister. And when I said that, she was looking up at me with the helmet hair and she just fixed me with that Gorgon glare, you know, those ice eyes, you know, and then she was taken away. And sort of halfway through the sort of prawn cocktail or something, I get this tap on my shoulder, just come and see me at number 10. I didn't get an immediate thing, but I think Charles Cole, her parliamentary private secretary, called me and said, the Prime Minister is able to see you. So I considered this, and I had a little dog called Growler, a Yorkshire Terrier, and Gary's smiling, remembering. And so I put Growler in the basket of the bike. I lived in Chelsea, and I cycled into Downing Street. And then the Prime Minister bustles in and says, good afternoon, everyone, good afternoon. Who's this, Mr. Geldof? I said, that's Growler, Prime Minister. Oh, Growler. But I didn't want confrontation. I wanted cooperation because the record stores weren't taking money. The publishers weren't taking money. The record companies weren't taking money. So it became emblematic of the callousness of this government. Late one Friday night, I got a call either from Nigel Lawson or Geoffrey Howe. And remember, I'm the singer in the Boomtown Rats. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer said, you can have the money. It's not VAT. It's a donation to the equivalent amount of the VAT taken. It's a one-off because their argument was, we do it for you, we have to do it for everyone. And that was the deal.
Richard Skinner.
Frankly, you know, you just looked at the figures that were coming in terms of sales and pre-orders. 500,000 pre-orders. This is before the record had even been made. Within a day of it being released, 1 million copies sold. And the cynics, you know, if all they had to do was to go to HMV or the Virgin Megastore and see people buying them, buying the singles by the dozen, The number of records sold was limited only by the number of records you could press. But I think that you had to virtually get the whole of Europe pressing this record up just to get to hit the demand. I mean, this was a phenomenon.
Retrospectively, as I hear it every Christmas now, especially as I get to the baked beans section of Tesco's, it seems to come on. So you get wizard at meat, you get what's blade at fish, you get and then baked beans. But when I hear that, it's so doom laden, and yet it's got this cranked off key bell of Christmas. So it really is a fabulous production.
John Moss.
I'm not known for hitting people, really, in general, but I remember after we made the record, it came out sitting in a pub in Hampstead, and somebody was slagging off the record, it's a con and everything, and I actually hit them.
You hit them?
I was so, I suppose, aggrieved that this prick was standing there. He knew nothing about it. He didn't know, and it was a different kind of emotion. I suppose it's a bit like somebody attacking your child.
And did they say, why did you do that? Or
No, they didn't, but they were just on the floor. I'm serious.
And Bob, can you just describe what it was like watching that video going out?
So I called Michael Grade, who was head of the BBC, who's a sort of radical, Michael, and he said, forget Top of the Pops, I'll give you a 5-minute programme for yourself before Top of the Pops, which is genius. And he said, do you want to introduce it? And I called David, and Bowie said, I'll do it.
Top of the Pops was the holy grail. At that point, nothing that I'd ever done had made Top of the Pops. So suddenly, not only this piece of film that I'd shot 4 or 5 days before was going on Top of the Pops, but it was being introduced by David Bowie. Oh my God, this is extraordinary. My parents were horrified at the work that I was doing. They wanted me to be a doctor or an architect or whatever. And my mother was just continuously horrified with the job that I did and was so affected by this record, she went and bought 2 copies.
Bob.
I was going into Simon Bates, I think it was, who did The Breakfast Show. And I wasn't ashamed when he put it on. And he said, this is a very important moment. He said, are you listening? He said. And so he said, at the end, he said, that's extraordinary. And he said, what line was that George Mike did? What was Boy George? What was Paul Young? He said, so we went through that. And so I said, look, it doesn't matter if you don't like the record. It doesn't matter if you don't like Tony Hadley or Boy George. It doesn't matter. Just go and buy it. Because pathetically, the price of a life this year is a 7-inch piece of plastic. And I think that resonated. And then I said, I promise you, every single penny of this record will go to somebody who needs it. No one has taken a cup of coffee. No one has taken a phone call out of that money in 40 years.
Hold everybody, please. First, I'd like you to meet Bob Geldof, who is really the inspiration for this whole thing.
In January of 1985, inspired by Band Aid, a group of American artists came together in Los Angeles to record We Are the World. Bob Geldof, fresh from a trip to Ethiopia, addressed the gathered musicians.
The Western world has got billions of tons of grain bursting in its silos, and we're not releasing it to people who are dying of hunger.
There are people dying.
Amongst many others, the song featured Lionel Richie, Tina Turner, Michael Jackson, Diana Ross, Paul Simon and Cyndi Lauper. In March 1985, Bob Geldof's unnerving talent for drumming up support for musicians was parodied by Spitting Image.
I'm afraid that if we don't do something now, by the end of the year, this compassion fatigue thing that I'm afraid of will set in.
Despite all the money raised, aid was slow to get through, and 6 months on, the situation in Ethiopia was still desperate. What followed in the July of 1985 was Live Aid, The benefit concerts in London and Philadelphia, they raised a further $125 million. In the almost 40 years since Band Aid, many other versions of Do They Know It's Christmas have been recorded, including this one from the BBC Singers. All these other countries wanted to do their own version, including the US. That must have been quite gratifying for everybody that had taken part in the original song.
Standing in Notting Hill with a bunch of Herberts and skirts and eyeliner is radically different to walking into a room with Quincy Jones, Ray Charles, Smokey Robinson, Stevie Wonder, Willie Nelson. I mean, I was, Quincy says, everybody knows Bob Geldof. No, nobody knows Bob Geldof.
And Bob, I mean, the record did face criticism, but has remained the best-selling record right until 1997.
This turned out to be a 40-year arc from a bang-together little Christmas song up to 2005 Live 8, which was 1,000 bands, now with new technologies, in 8 capital cities simultaneously, 1 million people on the streets of those capitals, forcing their leaders to do something and being able to coerce, through music, the leaders of the richest economies in the world and Vladimir Putin and Mandela in Johannesburg with South African bands online. So we moved technologically, but we'd also got to a point where these people can sit down to compromise, to achieve consensus. So that was that moment. You're not to know that when we all get in that little studio.
Yeah. It makes me sad because I think that it so evocatively conjures the disparity between the developing world and our own. And I think despite, Bob's best efforts and the enormous efforts of so many people in the intervening decades, that chasm, that poverty chasm still exists.
I just want to finish by asking John and Gary, hugely successful careers in music, and indeed Gary on the big screen, and your musical career goes on, John. Where does Band Aid fit into that? I mean, and you've got 3 kids. I mean, what does it mean to them too?
I mean, I went out with my kids. I mean, the oldest one's 26, the youngest one's 20. They know, not just their dad's in the film, but they know about Band Aid. They know what it stood for. And maybe, especially hearing Bob, you're still an amazing orator, Bob. It's fantastic listening to you. Maybe it's people have underestimated. I mean, it was a precursor, if you like, to social media, albeit in a sort of more limited way. So from many points of view, I think it was a milestone.
I think it reminded us what pop music was. Pop music is folk music. Folk music historically has been about protest. It's been about giving people information and bringing people together, whether it's a small village. In this case, it's the world. And I've eternally grateful to Bob as well, I have to say, because I think he celebrity is quite vacuous, and he gave some meaning to it for a brief amount of time. He also gave me 2 of the greatest days of my life, which I'll never forget.
Nigel, you of course said that it was a rough and ready putting it together, but look, when I just watched it several times over the last few days, what do you think of the video that you made now?
I've been very lucky. I've done over 400 music videos now for lots of amazing big records. And people say to me, what's your favourite video? And my response is always Band Aid. And I say, artistically, it's no great shakes, but it's the only piece of work that I've done in my life which has saved lives. For one day, I was asked to do something which, I'm just the bird on the back of the elephant and, just a small part, the cog in the wheel. But there's some guy who's in his 40s walking around in Ethiopia who might not have been alive, who has a wife and kids.
What did your role in this mean to you, Richard?
Being the opening and announcer of the show obviously was a great responsibility, but the main thing for me is that I'm proud to have been there, to be part of that event. But for whatever reason, I was there in the front line, and that's the proudest moment of my career. genuinely. And I concur with Nigel. I think we'll never do anything better in our lives.
And Bob, the life expectancy in Ethiopia has increased by more than 20 years since Band Aid. I mean, where do you rank that in the kind of achievements of people's pennies and people's pounds and people's generosity?
I go back to the very beginning. In the middle of the 80s, we were told that all of this is about nothing much more than the self. And it turned out that that was completely wrong. And that seemed to be intuitively understood by the musicians. I remember in Live 8 when Madonna brought out that girl, Birhan, elegant, beautiful girl, you know, in this toga. And ironically, she just completed her agricultural exams in the University of Northern Ethiopia 2 weeks before I'd asked her to come on to Live 8. That was the girl in that video that David Bowie introduced. Now, if it had just been for Birhan's single life, then everything the people in your room and Nigel in Colorado, if it had just been for that single life, then these 40 years have been worth it.
Thank you to John Moss, Gary Kemp, Mariella Frostrup, Nigel Dick, Richard Skinner, and of course, Sir Bob Geldof. Thank you.
Happy Christmas, guys.